Hey, everybody, welcome back to Engaging the Phenomenon. And today we are honored to have one of our former guests back on. I believe this is the third time, and that's Mitch Horowitz. He recently came out with another book, if you can believe that, uh, called Practical Magic, Ancient Tradition and Modern Practice. So, welcome back on, Mitch.
Thank you, my man. Great to be here. Great to see you.
Yeah, and I love your work. It's thorough. It's and I mean, you just have a way of communicating it that's like so smooth.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It means a lot to hear that from someone on the path, such as you.
Yeah, and I mean, great writing, super great sourcing and
Thank you.
citations, and just an eloquent speaker, you know.
Thank
So
you.
yeah,
I,
so
I
thank you.
appreciate your calling out the sourcing because the sourcing and citations mean a lot to me. I work very hard on them. I don't want people to have to scratch their head and wonder who said that, where was that, and I want people to go to my sources and hold my feet to the fire. I really feel it's very important for me to provide the reader with material that he or she can verify.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a researcher, source those citations and sources are invaluable. I mean, you could spend like 2 weeks reading a book and then like months and months and months going through the sources,
Right,
which are so
right.
important because it brings so much more context and nuance to what is actually being discussed. I
Yeah.
mean, even I mean, we can't like thoroughly investigate in every citation source, but we can even just dabbling in that is so
Hmm.
like help is so helpful.
Hmm.
And people like yourself and like somebody who else other comes to mind is Peter Lavenda, just like crazy sourcing. Like you'll spend so much time there, but this book, it's called Practical Magic, and I think this is a fantastic issue to discuss, especially in the modern context of UFOs and UAP. It's much bigger than that. It can get into cosmology and even the nature of reality. But that's kind of actually where we're going with the UFO conversation nowadays. There
Yes.
has, yeah, I mean, for many years there's been a contingent where it's UFOs and it has to be nuts and bolts in a way where it's like, I understand what they're trying to do. They're at in the very beginning, they were just trying to have UFOs seriously looked at as something real. So it had to be nuts and bolts. It had to be measurable. It had to be measured. It had to be real
Right.
in a scientific sense. So people worked very hard for that, and I respect and I understand that. But getting into the deeper question of the UFO, which people like Jacques Vallée
Mhm.
has been doing for decades, it gets to this. In order to truly talk about UFOs, you have to talk about the whole thing, the whole experience, the high strangeness.
Mhm.
He even wrote that book that is now the Invisible College called UFOs: The Psychic Solution,
Right.
which is incredible to tie everything in like that. So, you know, this idea of magic, I think, in the modern discussion around UAP is super important. So let's just for people watching, listening, what is magic?
I personally define magic as causative ritual. A person can approach that from a material perspective, or like me, a person can approach it from a metaphysical perspective. Very interested in some of the things that you were alluding to, non-locality, the quantum reversal of the arrow of time, all of which are not only real things, but actual logical and empirical necessities insofar as we've learned more about the nature of reality in our world in the late 20th, early 21st centuries. I think magic, it seems to me, self-evidently, has is something that is as old as recorded time itself, and actually even goes back into prehistory. I say magic is as old as the human story, but in fact it extends to the pre-human story in the form of our Neanderthal ancestors. Our Neanderthal ancestors, who strictly speaking were not human. They were not Homo sapiens. They were Homo neanderthalis, and they were very closely related to us, but different. They had physical differences in gait, spine, cranium, and so forth. Uh, they occupied the global scene prior to the emergence of Homo sapiens, and since the mid 19th century, uh, we have come into possession of objects of theirs that are talismans, for example, bear claws or eagle talons, things that might be worn around the neck to assist with the hunt. And this was a hunter-gatherer society in which the hunt was the dividing line between life and death. They also fashioned little statuettes about 4 inches high or so, which mid 19th century archaeologists termed Venus figurines. They're bulbous feminine figures with large bellies, not looking at all like what Neanderthal men and women looked like. People in a subsistence level of existence and community were not overfed, and yet they crafted these statues, these feminine bulbous statues, probably of an impregnated woman with pendulous breasts. These were probably fertility statuettes. So, assuming that our interpretation is right, um, our most ancient of ancestors, in a sense, Neanderthals died out 40,000 years ago, and they have a history much longer than that. They abided what we would recognize as a spirituality, a belief in the possibility of petitioning the extra-physical, a belief, I think, correctly and affirmed not only by millennia of testimony, but by logical necessities in the sciences as they've now come down to us, a belief that humanity and pre-humanity occupies both a material and extra-material existence, and that we can seek ways of relating to that extra-material existence, including means of petitioning. And then, of course, you find magic in the earliest books of the Old Testament, not to mention the most ancient of civilizations in Vedic culture, Egyptian culture, Persian culture. There's never been a time where humanity has not been involved with magic. And my aim in this new book, Practical Magic, is to try, best as I'm capable, of stripping away all the complexity, the ceremony, the liturgy, and asking what are the constituent elements of magic, if in fact anything happens at all. And again, one can approach the matter from a more materialist perspective, saying that the magical ritual cultivates behavior, self-suggestion, introduces an exotic element into life that inevitably changes its trajectory. That is sort of a leap from chaos theory. Or if you look at it metaphysically, and there's no reason not to look at it in both ways, metaphysically, the question of the selective powers of the psyche, the illusory nature, in fact, of time, the psyche's ability to participate in non-local experiences. Magic is that too. My aim in the book, after kind of marching through the history and the definitions and such, is to make it simple, is to really ask as best I can, what are the common elements that are present when the magical appeal, when the causative ritual makes something happen.
And interestingly enough, recently we had the in the UAP world, we can say the witness come forward, Jake Barber. He has his story of what he called originally. I think they changed their terminology a little bit, but they were saying, summoning UAP
Yes.
using consciousness.
Hmm.
So and they've
Yeah.
had these different terms. So this idea is not new, right? I mean, it's kind of you know even in the UFO world, there's been things like CE5
Sure.
and Mission Rama was doing program sightings where they're initiating contact with non-human intelligence. But of
Yes.
course,
Yes.
this idea is not new of humans using ritual or magic to
Right.
interact with non-human intelligences.
And I think we in the UFO seeking culture also are at this exciting, propitious moment because, as you were alluding, there's a convergence in conversation between the pursuit of occult and esoteric understanding, the pursuit of understanding around UFOs, UAPs. I realized while we were shooting the show Alien Encounters at Discovery that a lot of the participants in the show were speaking naturally, and as we all do, in generational terms. We nowadays, ever since Kenneth Arnold, will say, for a while there, because that was the orientation of our outlook, we spoke in mechanical terms. These are flying saucers and flying craft and so forth and so on. And in terms of beings, you know, our great grandparents might have spoken in terms of Martians or men from space. We say grays, um, long whites, and so forth. And all these things are, in fact, they're just generational language. You turn the dial back 150 years, those terms didn't get used. People would speak of goblins or leprechauns or fairies, and of course this is what inspired Jacques Vallée to start looking for convergences between myth and UFO reportage. And the deeper you start going into that query, the more and more you find is we're all having the same conversation. We're just using terminology that belongs to our era, and it's natural, and it marks every generation, and there's nothing that needs fixing, and there's nothing wrong with it. But it's important to realize that I'm just wearing the coat of my generation. I was enchanted with a story that Teddy Roosevelt wrote in the late 19th century, which is very recognizable as a Bigfoot encounter that he described. Um, Being told to him by a hunter in the wilderness along the Minnesota-Idaho border, which in the late 19th century was really hardcore wilderness, and Roosevelt was game hunting there. And um, he described what what to us would be instantly recognizable as a Bigfoot encounter, but he called it a goblin encounter because it wasn't until about 50 years later that the term Bigfoot or Sasquatch began to enter the vernacular. Uh, so one mustn't get hung up on these terms. Um, but once you kind of peel one layer of the onion away, you see that we're really all talking about the same thing with respect to testimony. And then, of course, the age that we're in now, which I suppose is the quantum age, is one in which we're discovering that classical physics, for all the wonder and understanding it has brought to our world, is just one portion of the story, and that quantum mechanics, not only in terms of um, material emergent from the particle lab, but more and more in terms of quantum computing, which hasn't even reached the public yet. We're only reading news of it, more or less. But the reportage emerging from quantum computing is extraordinary in terms of answers being sought to math problems that are so complex that it would take so much time to solve them that these math problems in in terms of the requisite time for solution require more than the age of the universe itself. Google engineers recently released a report saying that they submitted a math problem to their quantum computing prototype called Willow. And this problem, they estimated, would require 10 septillion years to solve. That's longer than the uh, projected age of the universe, tracking backwards and forwards. And Willow solved it, so they report, in under 5 minutes. And the engineers remarked, almost in this glorious aside, that this seems to lend support for the existence of a multiverse. In other words, Willow perhaps plucked the answer from another intersection of time or another dimension, because if you follow the arrow of time, the solution would be impossible. That's going to change our perception of what it means to be human. And it's just extraordinary, and it's all the more persuasive because evidence unsought is all the more convincing. The Google engineers are not seeking evidence of interdimensionality. They're seeking to make the world's fastest computer. But that's what they're finding. And people are talking about this in finance. They're talking about this in computational mechanics. They're talking about this in quantum physics. This is evidence unsought, and yet evidence all the more resounding for being so. Microsoft is working itself, of course, on a quantum computing model. And Microsoft engineers released a statement maybe 4 weeks ago where they said, we have created or stumbled upon a new form of matter, that the quantum bytes that are being used, uh, computer code is either a zero or a one. That's binary code. It's the DNA of all that is in a certain sense. And they have created electrons that are both positively and negatively charged at once, both zero and one at once. And this matter that they've stumbled upon or created, it exists in superposition. It's both one and zero at once. It's both positive and negative at once, which is what allows quantum computing to be so adaptable and flexible. And new forms of matter, plucking answers from other intersections of time. This was Ray Bradbury stuff when I was a kid. And today it's as real as the words I'm speaking. I feel melancholy about saying this because so many people are suffering under war, and I hate it. I hate it. But but it's an extraordinary time in the human story because we are on the brink of the quantum era in ways that I don't think we as a human community have fully realized yet.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's pretty crazy to think about. I mean, like we're becoming the non-human intelligence in effect that things that you heard about in UFO reports or even metaphysical experiences. We're seeing developments in technology, and people will argue, well, there's been reverse engineering of UFOs, and I mean, like UFOs in a sense, what they demonstrate seems like magic to us,
Yeah.
right? And but technologically, right? So there's this interesting, I guess you can say, perspective or assumption when we say magic, people automatically assume magical thinking,
Yeah,
right?
they recoil. Right, right, right.
So
I, go ahead.
go ahead, yeah, no, go ahead, go ahead.
No, I want to, it's funny, my man, because we're living in an era in which all these terms that get directed towards seekers, magical thinking,
Yeah,
survivor
right,
bias,
yeah.
cognitive bias, I've committed every bias known to humanity and invented a few. Um, at a certain point, the career skeptics, the rejectionist skeptics, they don't see it, of course, but they're practicing these very things that they're directing at the seeking community. Magical thinking at this juncture in time would be to suppose that interdimensionality is not a fundamental part of our physical reality, not just in a particle lab, but in terms of computing, um, in terms of UFOs, presenting a viable hypothesis that warrants further questioning, that warrants further research. And of course, this doesn't even get into the parapsychology dimension, ESP, telepathy, precognition, retrocausality. The bulletproof evidence for the presence of anomalous cognition, we'll say, is so strong that to deny it is magical thinking. To deny it is cognitive bias of whatever fashion. And it's funny, I don't quote Karl Marx very often, but
Hmm.
he said something to this effect, and I'm repeating it colloquially. It had to do with his reading of Hegel, so purists will have to forgive me. History repeats itself. The first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. And so we might have seen witch trials and witch burnings and absurdities like that as tragedy. And now we're seeing this stuff as farce, but it's not coming from professed believers. It's coming from people who perceive themselves as rationalists. There's simply no putting the genie back in the bottle. The material that you and I are talking about is material that our kids and the rising generation are going to be as fluent in as our generation is in digital tech and space launches, space travel, and all kinds of fascinating questions around neuroplasticity, the placebo effect, and so forth. Uh, None of that stuff is controversial at this juncture, and none of what we're discussing will be controversial for our kids as they age and for the rising generation. Um, AI at a certain point, I don't know when, could be next week for all I know, could be in 5 years. AI is going to eclipse Wikipedia as a go-to information source. And when that occurs, and I think the inevitability of that is fairly apparent, all the pseudo-skepticism, knee-jerk skepticism, career skepticism that mars documentation of some of these subjects in the area of parapsychology, for example, on Wiki, it's not going to be so important anymore because AI is going to sweep away a lot of that stuff. So, in terms of biases, a new day is dawning where it's important to understand these biases, but I suppose the phrase "watch the watchers" has to come into play because these people have to understand if they want to be a relevant part of the new paradigm, so to speak, that they're victims of biases that they labor to pin on others.
Yeah, and again, we have this convergence. We have the UFO disclosure idea, uh, basically a public acceptance of the UFO reality, a lot of insiders coming forward,
Mhm.
it being brought to Congress and discussed in a very serious way,
Yep.
as well as something like what all the discoveries and developments you've mentioned, alongside the telepathy tapes. And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and so, it was very intriguing
Yeah. Yeah.
work.
I have I never thought I would do a podcast. I never thought I would do a lot of things. I never thought I would start a Substack newsletter. I just did. And I also launched a podcast. It's a six-part historical podcast called Extraordinary Evidence, ESP is Real. And it provides a nice historical backdrop to telepathy tapes, among other things. And it's up now and it's free. And working on it was very exciting because I felt like I was documenting the effort of pioneers. Maybe it was a little bit like what Tom Wolfe felt like when he was writing the right stuff. There's a right stuff of parapsychology, and I try to capture it in there because the efforts that the parapsychologists, in other words, people who study as an academic science, non-locality, ESP, extraphysicality, retrocausality from a cognitive perspective, they're heroes to me. They're heroes. They have suffered such calumny. They have suffered such career assassination. They get smeared with names like pseudoscience, which is the kiss of death if you work in an academic setting, and yet they have endured, and their research has stood up. It stood up with bulletproof resiliency, and their work too has given us a vocabulary and a framing and an understanding and a data record of replicated facts and research that allows us to pursue this line of reasoning that the UFO phenomena may be interdimensional in nature, or it may be intergalactic in nature. There's no reason why there's not a lot of things going on. I mean, if there's one thing I've learned on the path, we live under many different laws and forces, and the validity of one of them doesn't rule out the validity of another.
Yeah, and then there's also the idea, in part to be intergalactic, you have to utilize interdimensional capacities or
Yes,
capabilities.
that's right. Gravity has to bend, time has to bend. Dig this. Um, I don't know why this is not more talked about. I guess, we're too fascinated, with other things, reaching us from influencers over Instagram or whatever. But astronauts in our own era, even though they're moving nowhere near the velocity of light speed, they are experiencing minute but measurable reductions in the aging process. Time does bend. Einstein theorized, and his theories have since been proven in his law of special relativity, that time is not absolute. Time bends in conditions of extreme gravity, like a black hole. Time bends in conditions of extreme velocity. Not, not for the participant himself. The astronauts don't feel like, hey, I'm getting younger. But from our perspective on Earth, and when they come back home and we measure their vitals, the aging process has slowed. How far out is that? And it's due to velocity. Einstein was right. And it's surreal, and it's absolutely concretely true.
Yeah, and I mean, one film that touched on a lot of these different elements was Interstellar.
Boom. Yes.
Just like crazy awesome
Yeah. And
portrayal
the
of some of
and
these.
and the public can digest it. That's the thing. It's like sometimes I'm told by TV producers, uh, the phrase "dumb it down" is the phrase you should never use with me. Nobody should ever say "dumb it down, Mitch." It's
Yeah,
like time out. Um, Smart it up, because the fact is, if you look at movies like Intergalactic and Oppenheimer, for that matter, and Everything Everywhere All at Once, there's a lot of fucking complexity in those movies. And the public doesn't have a problem understanding it. I think that the fact is the American public and people, of course, around the world consists of people who have all kinds of technical training. Um, they're draftsmen, they're engineers, they're mechanics, they practice the trades. I mean, they get it. If Oppenheimer, as a movie, can explain to a viewer how the atomic bomb is made, we can damn well talk about interdimensionality and UFOs. People are ready for this, not as a prediction, but as a fact. And you see it in the popularity of a movie like Intergalactic.
yeah, Interstellar, and
Interstellar, I beg your
yeah,
pardon.
no, that's all right. We were talking about the intergalactic and the
Right.
transdimensional.
And I must say, I saw a wonderful movie the other night here in New York, where I live, called The Uninvited. And I'm gonna look up and mention the name of the writer director before the end of our podcast, because her name deserves to be mentioned, because it was so brilliant. But it was basically a kind of comedy of manners that takes place in L.A., where a lot of people's lives are falling apart. And the director, whose name is Nadia Connors, and she also wrote the screenplay. She originated the thing as a play. She's playing with time throughout the whole thing. There's retrocausality going on. There's people coming from the past, future, present, and it all hangs together like this beautiful drama. It's funny, it's tragic, it's poignant, and there's going to be a point, and she brilliantly incorporates all that material into the film. And again, it's kind of a comedy of manners, and more we're going to see these themes in our popular media, just like we're seeing Gnostic themes appearing everywhere. And the notion that the world we live in is it's airsats. There's something wrong. Something's not quite right. We see that in Barbie, for example. Now, that's important to me because the Barbie movie was popular not only here in the States, obviously, but it was popular in China, it was popular in Saudi Arabia, and everyone got it. China is an officially atheistic society, Saudi, a very deeply religiously conservative society. The United States is sort of everything everywhere all at once, and we're all
Yeah,
grooving to this message, and we all agree with it. And you're like, yeah, I know what you're talking about. This world of ours, something's wrong. It feels really weird. And so,
yeah.
people around the world are participating in this media, and we're speaking a common language.
And you brought this up a few times, retrocausality. And
Uh,
interestingly enough, the person that put me onto that a number of years ago was Dr. Gary Nolan. If I had heard
Bravo, bravo. Yeah,
retrocausality out of nowhere, I might think, I don't know. But,
yeah.
I have
As
to
a
say,
bio, please.
yeah, just coming from Gary, he's like, check this out. He put me onto Eric Wargo's
Yeah.
book and website, The Night
Timeless.
Church. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was blown away. And it took a while to sink in. And, and
It
actually,
does.
yeah. But since it opened my mind to different even experiences that I have had personally, including something I had akin to an NDE, that I was face to face with this entity, and it was like this whole experience. But I actually, in some sense, it feels like, I had experiences when I was younger, like a very young child, and later on, and now I'm having trouble trying to parse, like, where did it begin? Did it actually begin in the future when that
Yes.
NDE type happened and reverberated back and forth through time?
That
So,
is such a wonderful question and framing. Did it begin in the so-called future?
yeah.
Did your experience begin in the future? That's the query that
Yeah.
retrocausality places us all in front of. It's extraordinary. And to unpack it for a moment, of course, you learn about it from Gary, so brilliant. Um, and he's a biophysicist, and Gary's been dealing with a lot of cutting edge and empirical ideas for a very long time. So important to say that a man like Gary Nolan, lovely man, he's a theoretician, but he's also an empiricist. He's dealing with things as real as you know water being wet. And um, retrocausality as a concept, it summons up a lot of emotions for people because it challenges our perception of self and life. And there's a lot of people who would say, hey, um, stuff cannot travel backwards in time. That's impossible. Einstein proved it's impossible with his second law of thermodynamics, which, put metaphorically, says you can't unbreak an egg. It's not happening. And that's true for classical physics. Newton was right. Einstein was right. But Einstein knew that physics is open at the top, so to speak. And for quantum physics, retrocausality is a given. It's a given. I mean, I was born in 1965. That year, the great James Feynman, the physicist, Richard Feynman, I beg your pardon, won the Nobel Prize in physics for a discovery of a particle called a positron, which is basically an electron that reverses in charge and reverses in time. And interference patterns demonstrate its actual traveling backwards in time, not metaphorically, but concretely. And this was Feynman's equivalent of Einstein's relativity theory. Now, retrocausality has been a concept long abided, certainly since I've been born, in quantum physics. But the great Darrell Bem, a cognitive psychologist at Cornell, released a paper in 2011 where he helped to establish retrocausality not just as a particle phenomena, but as a cognitive phenomena, a cognitive fact, not a perception, but a measurable fact. And what Bem did, to make a long story short, was he spent 10 years of his life studying and documenting precognition, which, as I said, he published in a paper in 2011. The last two experiments that Bem conducted on this path were in cognitive retrocausality, where, in short, subjects would memorize a word list, and then they would repeat back how many words they could memorize on the list. So let's say you memorize a list of 10 words, and then the experimenter asks you to repeat them back. You'll remember five or six, pretty ordinary. But with this added wrinkle, he asked people then to take word tests, repeat the words back, but with the added wrinkle that you continue studying your word list into the so-called future. And participants who studied their word list into the so-called future experienced a spike in scores of 1 to 2% invariably, at least as a pooled fact, on their exams. And Bem published this paper, and he was met with a chorus of mockery and career and character assassination. It was just awful what the man was put through. And yet, 10 years hence, Bem's results were confirmed in a meta-analysis encompassing uh, 90 experiments in 33 different labs in 14 different nations. Those numbers, in terms of data body that are being pooled and studied, are better than the numbers that support most of the prescription drugs, that I'm going to take when we're done with our podcast. And and the rap that you'll hear on Wiki and so forth is that, oh, these ESP experiments, they always prove non-replicable. That's fiction. It's absolutely fiction. It's always been fiction. But a heroic figure like Bem is able to demonstrate such in our own era, and there's plenty of other such people who do this work as well. Dean Radin, really, I think, pioneered the field of precog study in its most fruitful form within clinical lab settings. He and Bem have collaborated plenty. And Bem's data, again, is the genie that simply can't be put back in the bottle. It's as real as it gets. These experiments have not only been replicated worldwide, but they've been replicated in different languages, including Italian. Um, this is real. And it begs the question of whether we five sensory beings, in speaking in conventional terms, I think we require linearity as a necessary illusion to get through life. If you say to me, Mitch, we're going to do our pod tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern time, I have to show up or there's chaos. I can't say to you, well, man, I showed up retrocausally, or something, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that it's ultimately real. It doesn't mean that it's ultimately real. Uh, Time, the so-called arrow of time, that belongs to the most commonly observed phenomena in our physical world. But we're entering a new era, which I don't think we fully dipped our toes into yet as a general public, a quantum era in which discussions of retrocausality are going to become as imperative as discussions of the subconscious mind were in the early 20th century.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking a little bit. I mean, we have this idea of UFO disclosure, right?
Mm.
The acknowledgement of non-human intelligence as a fact engaging with humanity on the table. Also on the table, general artificial intelligence,
Yeah,
uh, quantum computing, right? This is freaking magic, right?
it's unbelievable. If I may, I'm going to add one more thing to the mix. Um, the chief scientist of the James Webb Deep Space Telescope program published a paper recently. I think it was in the adventurously titled journal Monthly Notes, which is issued by the um, astronomical arm of the British Royal Society. And in his paper, uh, trying to remember his name, Lior Shamir, I believe it is the scientist. In his paper, he disclosed that um, the James Webb Deep Space Telescope has been taking photographs recently of hundreds of different galaxies, hundreds in a certain quadrant of the universe. I feel like Captain Kirk talking this way, but that's what they're doing. And and what the researchers discovered is that a significant majority of the galaxies being photographed in this particular quadrant they were focused upon um, were moving, rotating in an opposite direction from our own. Our galaxy moves counterclockwise. The other galaxies, a majority of them, were moving clockwise. And he theorized that one of the reasons for this, because he said there's no real theoretical reason or physical reason to expect other than a 50-50 distribution. But but in fact, 50% more galaxies are moving clockwise, opposite our own. He said, this may be because we exist, our galaxy exists inside of a gigantic black hole, and we have a different gravitational field than these other galaxies do. They're not the oddballs out. We're the oddballs out. And to read this in the sober monthly notes issued by the British Royal Society by the lead researcher on the Webb telescope, theorizing that we live in a black hole. You know, this is wilder than anything you and I talk about, and it's as real as it gets. Now, it's a theory, of course, but these are the kinds of things that the rising generation is going, they're going to understand it. They're going to understand it more than we do. To us, this still feels like I can't deal with this, you know. But is it a form of magic? Yes, in that reality is behaving in ways other than common observation, and and through magic, I guess if I wanted to get flowery and poetic about it, I could compare a researcher to a magician and say they're engaging in causative ritual, but what they're really engaging in is measurement. And what are our five senses, so to speak, than means of measurement? We touch, we taste, we measure perspective, we measure things. And we've discovered that in the particle lab, at least, measurement localizes stuff that's in superposition only becomes local and real and concrete once an observer or an automated device elects to take a measurement. So it seems to me that this whole question of focus, perspective, emotion, conviction, assumption may, via the biological technology of our own senses, have the capacity to localize.
Well, and I want to get back to this idea and this theme of practical magic. And interestingly enough, you start in the beginning of the book with Jack Parsons,
Yeah.
and people who are familiar with UFO research and some of the recent books like Dr. Diana Pasulka's American Cosmic. We know now James Masters is actually Dr. Gary Nolan, that she disclosed that. Gary disclosed that. And there's this individual named Tyler D. Everybody kind of knows his identity now as Timothy Taylor, NASA engineer. And especially this individual that was pseudonamed Tyler D. was participating in these rituals, so to speak, and getting these results, which seemed like non-local reception of information that helped him with patents and all this thing. So that's a very practical application of magic because there's a result coming from it that seems tangible.
Hmm.
It's another thing I find very interesting about what we call CE5 or contact work is that you're doing what could be considered a ritual, and there's a very tangible result.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I think that's a wonderful point. I think that's a wonderful point. And we as a human community have always taken an inside outside approach to research. I'm not a clinician. I'm not a parapsychologist. I'm not doing lab research. I'm a seeker, but I can interact with my colleagues in those worlds, and I have many of them, and raise questions with you and your listeners. Obviously, some of your listeners and viewers are themselves scientists and clinicians. I'm going to say more about that in just a moment. But I can interact with you and other seekers, and we can talk about these things as applied possibilities. And we must, because we're in the business of trying to understand reality, and we have common cause more and more with researchers in the hard sciences for the simple reason that non-locality, extraphysicality, quantum reality, retrocausality, these are terms that our colleagues in the sciences use for things that mystics have discussed for millennia. And this is no joke. This is what I was speaking about earlier, where experiencers might come to the table and say, uh, tall gray, reptilian, you name it, any number of names that are used for non-human intelligences or intergalactic beings or whatever. But the vocabulary belongs to our generation, but the actuality belongs to the search, and it's just extraordinary. I'll mention something else that's quite remarkable. In the Journal of Physics, let's say about a year ago, there appeared an article on, it's very interesting, light orbs or ball lightning as possible explanations for certain UFO sightings. But the uh, the researchers, to their great credit, added two caveats. Caveat one was that if ball lightning or plasma balls, light plasma, can explain certain UFO sightings, listen, that's just theoretical. I mean, this is just a hypothesis. It's not meant to dispel the search. It's meant to contribute to the search. But they went one further and they said, plasma balls, ball lightning, it's material composed of photons, but uh, it may be a, a form of pre-life. It may be a form of pre-biological life. This may be the soup, the stuff, intergalactically, from which life emerges, just as we theorize that on our own planet and on others, life emerges from water. That's the primordial soup that gives rise to life. At least that's a prevailing theory. And these physicists theorized in this article that plasma balls themselves may be a form of pre-life. And so it's interesting where one person could, it's like a Rorschach, one person could
Mm.
look at that and say, oh, so these guys are saying that the New Jersey drones or other things, maybe they were ball lightning. Well, maybe. But they're saying something much more extraordinary, which is that this so-called ball lightning or these plasma balls are themselves primordial forms of life. Again, summoning Captain Kirk. It's really extraordinary, James. I'm very heartened uh, by what we're living through. We're not going to get to finish any of this, um, and there's so much agony on our planet. It's just horrible. But these advances are very real.
Yeah,
Oh, I want
it's
to say something about your colleagues and your viewership. Um, we have more colleagues than we know within the hard sciences. I dialogue all the time with people in finance, mathematics, engineering, physics, and so forth. The people throwing around terms like survivor bias or whatever. We'll try to coin a few new ones before our time is up.
Mhm.
These are from these guys and gals are from the social sciences and the humanities, and they have no bloody idea what they're talking about. That's where the materialism is. That's where the critique is. The sciences, by and large, are not materialistic. Um, you've probably got viewers who are getting their PhDs in physics. And in addition to whatever it was that inspired the previous generation, they may be inspired by some of the stuff we're talking about now. I find that I have wonderful evenings, wonderful conversations with hardcore scientists. I get called names by people who are kind of, I don't know, I guess they fancy themselves like skeptic bloggers, again, folks in the humanities, um, social sciences, psychology, social psychology. Um, there's a whole other topic on why materialist biases are stronger in that world. Some of it, not all of it, is rooted in just sheer ignorance of the subject matter. Some of it may be rooted in some cultural stuff, which is part of a totally different discussion. But in terms of the sciencing, is actively hypothesized, and I think that's very positive.
yeah, and it's really interesting in the especially more recently, but I'd fair to say probably for decades, the UFO subject or UAP subject attracts people from the sciences, people from
Hmm.
occult studies, mystical
Yep.
studies, um, even people from social sciences, right? It kind of draws everybody in. You know, it's like the modern. I don't know what to call it. You probably have a better terminology for that, but it kind of it bridges a lot of different fields.
It really does. And you had mentioned Jack Parsons, and Jack is almost a personification of the very thing you were just referencing. Jack, in the first part of the 20th century, was a very highly regarded rocket scientist. He was the co-founder of Jet Propulsion Lab. There are some people who say that mythically the initials
Yeah.
of Jet Propulsion Lab, JPL, stand for Jack Parsons Lab. And Jack was also an occultist, a protege for a time of Aleister Crowley. And towards the end of his life, he died way too young, as the best people often do. In 1952, he was blown up in a pyrotechnics explosion in his home lab. Um, Jack wrote to his wife, Marjorie Cameron. It was a difficult time in his life. He had been kind of cut loose by Crowley. They had disagreements. He had formed an ill-fated friendship with L. Ron Hubbard, and Hubbard stayed in his house, stole his girlfriend, stole his money, and made off to Miami. Always what you look for in a house guest. And and Jack was alone and despairing, and he wrote to Cameron, "Look, every idea war that's ever been won in human history has been won through the principle of simplicity, and at this point, magic does not have it." So that became my North Star when I was working on this book. I was so moved to read that because I have had this hunger to try to locate simplicity within magic, to try to find what are the agencies that allow something to happen, if anything's going to happen at all. And I think that's what Jack was looking for. So, uh, however good a job I did, my effort is attributable to his example.
Well, and again, just to tie in the kind of UFO research angle, Diana Pasulka also highlighted in American Cosmic that the aerospace industry as a whole has been involved in ritual and what we would consider ritual magic for their science, right? Like when they
Yeah.
do launches, all the dates that they do launches and all these different, there's an individual who received a lot of criticism, but Richard Hoagland uh, wrote a book and he was describing all the Masonic involvement
Mhm,
in a lot of that in
mhm,
NASA,
mhm.
right? The symbology and again, it's much deeper than just symbols placed somewhere, right? There's a deep understanding of that kind of knowledge implemented into actual science, right?
Yes. I think I've been unfair sometimes to people like Hoagland. I have an allergy to conspiracies because they scare me. I don't like where they often end, not in terms of history or data or empiricism, but they often end in a lot of us versus them thinking that renders a complex world very simple. And and yet I think I've been unfair. I think I've been too ready to sort of throw away um, some thinking that might be described as conspiratorial. Maybe we need a different term. Maybe that term just has too much baggage. But I'm trying to be more open, to weighing some of these things in a less emotional way.
Yeah, and I mean that that's not to say everything he spoke about or wrote about was accurate, but
Dig.
again, just these again, the simple, right? Some of these
Yeah.
the simpler ideas or the basic stuff that he was talking about, there was just interesting correlations. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's true. Look, I mean, there certainly was involved people who had adult lifelong dedications to Masonry were involved, very heavily involved in the Apollo program, including astronauts themselves. This is a historical fact, and it's almost impossible for an individual to get involved with an esoteric fraternity like Freemasonry. Now, speaking of conspiracies, I have very high regard for Masonry, and I'll brook no nonsense about all these Masonic conspiracies, which I think amount to urban legendary. Um, but that said, I have a very, very high estimation of Freemasonry, a great love for Freemasonry. And once a person is involved in that path, um, thinking in terms of symbol, ritual, the architecture and the nature, almost the magical nature of memory, these things become part of a person's outlook. I am not a Freemason myself, but I've spent my time in that world and in those circles, and I'll spend more. But that was part of the space program is historically a fact in terms of um, cross-pollination of key individuals with the space program and Masonry. Now, Masonry used to be a much larger organization. We're no longer a nation of joiners. It's very common to find ambitious young men in their communities joining Masonry. That's not exactly the case any longer. But even there, even with regard to Masonry, I see at lodges around the country, some of which I've had the privilege to speak at, there's a rebirth of esoteric Masonry, and I view that as a very positive development.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, what Diana Pasulka also noted in her book was that the Soviets, they were using their form of mysticism in the space programs, which I don't know too much about, but the
Yeah,
cosms or
yeah, cosmism. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, it's incredible. It's beautiful as far as I'm concerned. I mean, um, Velikovsky, I think it was Igor Velikovsky, who was the philosophical founder of cosmism, and his basic outlook was humanity's future is in the stars, so to speak. Earth is the cradle of humanity, but the infant cannot remain in the cradle forever. And my friend Robert Zubrin, an engineer who wrote the great book, The Case for Mars, which I was privileged to publish, um, I couldn't speak for Bob. I've never known him to be somebody who has any spiritual or parapsychological interests, but cosmism is an outlook that he finds very appealing.
yeah, it's just fascinating that this is interwoven into our history, even in the
Yes.
scientific fields.
Absolutely true. And of course, the Soviets were dedicated to parapsychological research, which last I heard, the Russian government has remained dedicated to. And again, the Soviet Union was an officially atheistic society, an officially materialistic society. Um, but you change the vocabulary around so that you don't bother General so and so, and you've got a psychical research program that's world class.
And again, here again, practical magic, remote viewing, right?
Yeah,
The
exactly.
Stargate program, right? They were
Right,
implementing psi in a
right,
practical way of
exactly,
intelligence gathering, right?
exactly. And there's such prejudice around it, and there's such misinformation. Um, the material from Stargate, which began roughly speaking early 1970s, around 1972, and then President Bill Clinton cut the funding for Stargate in 1995, after which the material was supposedly declassified. And it's not exactly true because the declassifying process took a long time. The material was not declassified until the early 2000s, and some colleagues of mine, one of whom is a parapsychologist, um, who, of all things, is employed by a Vatican-based university, um, and he and some colleagues wrote a paper validating the Stargate findings according to meta-analysis and replication. Um, and I'm writing about a lot of this material in a forthcoming paper myself about the more or less the discrimination against some of the topics that we're talking about within prevailing social science literature. I don't mean to paint with too broad a brush because, as you pointed out, there are plenty of people in the social sciences who do care about these topics, and parapsychology itself is affiliated with the American Psychological Association. So um, there is support, albeit minority support, for these pursuits within some quarters of the social sciences. But in any case, um, Stargate fell victim to I would say, ideological skeptic prejudice. And if you go to Wiki, you'll find that the results were non-confirmatory, non-replicated. That's incomplete and poorly sourced. Wiki's articles on parapsychology are spiked. They're mostly sourced to the same places over and over and over. It's a handful of places that emerge from a publishing company in Buffalo, New York called Prometheus. Ironically enough, seems to be anti-Prometheus, but we're all at liberty to choose our own names. So Prometheus books, which used to be much larger than it currently is, publishes the articles and such. And so on Wiki, you'll read that the remote viewing program, psychic spying, Operation Stargate, was a failure. It was not a failure. It had many results that proved very important. Jimmy Carter himself, the same year that Bill Clinton cut the program, spoke about its successes to a group of students at Emory University in Atlanta. And Carter told a story, which I've written about before, where he told the kids, during my presidency, he was asked specifically if he had encountered any data that proved the existence of UFOs, and he said he had not. But he said, I do want to share this story with you. And Carter said that during his presidency, a Soviet Tupolev spy jet with all kinds of sophisticated tech on board crashed in Central Africa in the nation of Zaire. And it crashed in a very in the dense foliage of a jungle area, and as such, spy satellites and search planes couldn't find it, and it was very important to the CIA that this jet get recovered before Soviet reconnaissance teams got to the scene, because if CIA reconnaissance teams could get there first, it was apparently a payload of espionage tech, and we could figure out just what those guys are up to. And so it's very important. And Carter told the students that two remote viewers asked to uh, were given a general idea of where the thing was. They were asked to come up with longitude and latitude coordinates and see if they could get any visual hits. And they came up with the coordinates. They came up with visual hits. One of them drew the tail of a plane kind of sticking up from out of the ground. Well, the jet had crashed into a swamp, which is why it was out of. And Carter told the students that a recon team went there, they got there, they found the remote viewers were exactly right. You can't measure that on any actuarial table. And I want to add one more thing. Um, the man of letters, Gary Wills, made fun of Carter for this in the New York Review of Books, talking about how loopy he was, how strange he was. Wills himself is a man of the Catholic faith, and it's extraordinary to me that you could structure your life around warranted belief in the extraphysical, and then when that belief is actually applied and spoken about by someone like Carter, who is not known as a fount of occult passions, um, and when that belief is applied and it proves empirically successful, um, the messenger is shot. The messenger is killed. And the great John Mack, another man we lost way too soon,
Yeah.
he said in an interview at one point that the ultimate sin in the academy is talking about application of anything extraphysical. We can talk about it in philosophy. We can talk about it in poetry and dreams and psychology and psychedelic experience. But the moment the individual starts talking about the application of these ideas in a concrete way in the world that we live in, that's the ultimate sin against the manner in which Western civilization perceives itself. But that is changing. That is changing.
Yeah. And, you mentioned the wiki thing, and there was this whole thing on UFO Twitter where they discovered the people in Wikipedia that were responsible for some of the censorship of information. And I mean, Luis Elizondo, right, the guy who was involved with the ATIP program, he tried to correct the Wikipedia on his birth location, and they wouldn't even let him do that, even though he had all
That's
the
right.
proof and evidence of his birth.
Outrageous.
And they,
Outrageous.
yeah, just
Yeah.
all these other, and this obscuring. But
And if I may add to Lou's account, Dean Radin, a parapsychologist who's a friend and who's been a great influence on me, Dean has had the exact same experience of um, the, I don't know what you call them, the activists who sort of spike the books over at Wiki. They block just basic corrections
yeah.
of birth dates and hometowns and what's the conspiracy if Dean grew up in Racine, Wisconsin, and he's got his birth certificate? No, no, not good enough. Um, and and I used to despair over it. I really did. But I'm no longer despairing because I it's going to be overshadowed by AI. And if AI turns out what it's cracked up to be, it will prove more objective than the activists who spike Wiki. Now, of course, people say AI is just going to be a mirror of us, garbage in, garbage out, and that's a valid criticism. But the hope is, the ideal is that AI is going to come up with its own ways of independent reasoning and research and channels of information. And I'm willing to stake my chips on that being a better outcome than what we're seeing on the UFO and parapsychology articles on Wiki, which are a shambles due to what you were describing.
Yeah, and again, Dean Radin, just an absolutely fantastic researcher. We've had him here on the channel. I highly recommend checking out all his books. They're all
Yeah.
fantastic. But I want to see if we can tie this knot here. We're talking about the idea of kind of like the stigma, right? That is getting in the way from even being objective, right?
Mhm.
And what we were talking about before we started recording of Gurdjieff and the terror of the situation.
Mhm. Oh, you're asking how does this relate to the terror of the
Yes,
situation?
yeah,
Yeah, I see. Well, for Gurdjieff, the phrase terror of the situation referenced the primary thrust of his philosophy, which is that the individual is asleep. The individual is an automaton, not in some metaphorical way, but really, truly, and actually. That we live a somnambulant existence. We are sleepwalking. We are hypnotized. We are absolutely persuaded of the logic of our decisions, um, the purposefulness of our actions, and we are in pieces. We are acting under impulses that we know nothing about. We think of ourselves as intellectual beings, but as he described it, I think with bracing accuracy, uh, humanity, the human individual, the individual, uh, has different thinking centers, an intellect, a body, emotions, and the intellect is the weakest of all of them. If that wasn't true, there, for example, there'd be no addictions. A person would say to him or herself, well, this smoking is really killing me, so I'm just going to stop. Well, the intellect doesn't have that power. It's like putting a hamster wheel against a nuclear turbine, really. And and Gurdjieff would compare the emotions to a horse. And of course, anybody who knows horses knows um, they're very excitable, and if they get frightened or angry, they will kick, and there's danger there. And intellect is not going to control that. And so the terror of the situation is that we, as a human community, walk around with all these beautiful ideas about our ethics and our lives and what we're aiming to do. And he said, man has no ethics, man has no philosophy of life. Man lives by the imperative of I like and I don't like. Someone makes a big statement about free speech. Well, they make that statement because the speech at question is something that they like. If the speech is not what they like, uh, then suddenly the ball game is very different. Of course, everyone listening to this naturally thinks, yeah, well, that's the other guy. That's not me. That's not me. Well, of course it is. We just don't observe ourselves. That's the terror of the situation. Gurdjieff visited him. He was Greek Armenian, lived in Russia, and after the Russian Civil War had to flee, wound up in Paris. Um, and Gurdjieff visited the U.S. in the 1920s, early 1920s, for the first time. And There was a story that was told to me by Jacob Needleman, now deceased. He said it may have been apocryphal, but this is the story. A reporter said to Gurdjieff, Mr. Gurdjieff, can you sum up your philosophy for the people of America in one sentence? And Gurdjieff looked at him and said, think. And every time we hear that, we're persuaded that it's the other guy who's not thinking. You know, it's that moron over there who's not thinking. We're incapable of applying it to self. That's the terror of the situation.
Yeah, and you gave a wonderful lecture on Gurdjieff that I'm gonna post in the description so people can watch it.
Thank you.
And just incredible. And I only came across his work more recently within the last year or so. And again, that your lecture was a great contribute to my dabbling in
Thank you.
Gurdjieff. And d- in that lecture, you said something, so I'm going to ask you, what is Gurdjieff like?
Oh, as a human being?
No, like what is his work like? You know, there's a quote you had
Oh,
is
I
like,
beg your pardon. Oh, yeah. Some of Gurdjieff's work, especially his magnum opus, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, it deters casual readership. He was trying to disrupt our rote thought processes. Some people describe Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson as this unreadable book, as this, catastrophe of alphabet soup where the guy is just making up his own words and everything. And I'll say two things about that. The first is it's a hell of a lot more readable than people have been led to believe. In fact, it can almost work a kind of interesting spell on you where you go into it and there's almost this osmosis-like state. And, as I often say to people, you just have to keep turning those pages, keep turning those pages. Don't get hung up. It's not as hard to read as rumor sometimes has it, but it is also hard to read from the sense of using our ordinary intellects. He was trying to disrupt rote thought, and he said that the book should be read 3 times. Of his series of books, which he called All and Everything, uh, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson is book one. Now, a more readerly book of Gurdjieff's, which a lot of people go to and which I encourage, is Meetings with Remarkable Men, which is semi-autobiographical. There's also a very, very good book written, I mean, a classic of classics written by his student P.D. Uspensky called In Search of the Miraculous. And that is the irreplaceable um, exposition of Gurdjieff's ideas. I wouldn't say everything is in there because the man was filled with multitudes, but In Search of the Miraculous is a wonderful place to start, as is all Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. I mean, you just dive into the deep end of the pool. But his wish was to disrupt rote thought.
yeah. And now I kind of want to bring this whole discussion home in a sense. Uh, without giving away the entire book, right? It's practical magic. So what are some examples that you give in practical magic of, okay, cutting out um kind of I don't want to say unnecessary
No, no, right, I
because
dig. Yeah.
some of that stuff were formulas in a sense, but there's ways to simplify it. So what were some examples of the applications of the practicality of magic?
Um, in my wish to strip magic down, reduce it to its bare essentials, the gambit that I arrive at, and I think I defend it persuasively, is that the driving force behind magic throughout all of human history, often referenced in oblique terms in historical literature, in the traditions, Taoism, Kabbalism, early scripture, as well as in more modern traditions. Um, the animating force is sexuality. And one of the things I talk about in the book is this practice of sex transmutation, where it has nothing to do with abstinence or um, avoidance of sex or anything. I was talking about this on Duncan Trussell, and he said, "Oh no, don't tell me I'm not going to be allowed to jerk off." And I said, "No, rest assured, it's not a problem." but at a time and place of your own choosing, in private, at a time and place of your own choosing, when you feel the sexual urge, rather than doing the ordinary thing, which is to satisfy it physically. I mean, obviously, sexuality expresses itself through a physical pleasure, through physical procreation. Those are the most traditional means in which we experience sexuality, but there's something else going on, and I think Socrates alluded to this in the Symposium. This has been alluded to in many of the traditions and modern practices as well. You make a mental shift, so to speak, in which you direct the sexual desire in service of some cherished task, whatever it is, something that's important to you. It could be a job interview. It could be the completion of a very important piece of work. It could be the creative act. It could be athletic, whatever it is. When you feel the sexual urge at times and places of your own private choosing, you redirect it through a mental shift towards a vital task. And you will find that you are capable of summoning greater energy, enthusiasm, intellectual acumen, creativity, um, sharpness of thought to what you're completing. And it's interesting because we hear the term sex magic all the time, and this is sex magic. This is sex magic. There are also other forms that I write about in the book. But one of the reasons why I'm dissatisfied with magic that has a very heavy, thick liturgical ceremonial component where there's pageantry and pre-ceremony and ceremony and very thick requirements of memorization and steps. To me, that deters the very passion that's at the heart of magic. And it's ironic because we often see prayer or congregational spirituality or spiritual rites and rituals as the summoning of emotion. And for some people, that's absolutely true. For some people, that's absolutely true. That has not been the case for me. I feel that as soon as I'm turning through the back pages of my mind or going through steps in a book or again liturgy, ceremony, pageantry, um, that impulse, that magical impulse, which I think is the sexual impulse, which I think is the source of life, seeking creation, not only procreation, but seeking creation through the individual's uh, capacities written of in our oldest religious writings. In scripture, we read God created man in his own image. To me, that's just a later iteration of the Hermetic dictum, as above, so below. As we were created, so are we intended to create within our own sphere of experience. And I think that the force behind that creation is sexuality, which we understand biologically, and of course we should understand it biologically, but that's not the only game in town. So that's one of the exercises I get into. Sex transmutation, if you take nothing else away, actually, I often say if you take nothing else away from the book, take this. I'll say two things. If you take nothing else away from the book, sex transmutation, and I've said this before, and I'm going to say it until the day I am silenced, get away from cruel people. Nothing does more to sap your sense of self, of conviviality, of self-respect, of creativity, of pursuit of your wishes than to be around cruel people. Get away from them and burn your bridges behind you. I don't care if it's your mother-in-law. I don't care if it's your best friend. I don't care if it's your coworker. There may be instances where, for reasons of economics or other things, what I suggest is impossible, and I honor that. And there are ways to deal with that. Uh, but but you get away from cruel people. I don't know that that can be defined as magic in conventional terms, but you will bloom.
Yeah, I mean, even in different traditions, contemplative traditions, they say, keep holy company, right?
Yeah, beautiful.
Uh, what, you know, what do you want people to walk away with when in the idea of magic in general?
I suppose I want them to understand that it's been a part of the human situation, and as we were discussing earlier, even the pre-human situation from time immemorial, literally, and that we live in a new era in which we're learning so much in terms of empiricism that maybe used to be called testimony, and I honor testimony. Testimony is a record. Where would we be without the experiencers and their testimony? And now so much is being validated. I suppose all I'm really trying to say is understand that we all have more tools at our disposal than we believe. And people feel hopeless. They think, "Oh God, I'm stuck in life. I can't get anywhere." There are tools there. And you and I spoke about retrocausality. That occupies a whole chapter in the book. I think it's the best thing I've ever written on it. I tell a story. I won't go into it in detail here, but in short, I tell a story about a friend here in New York who really needed a job. And there was a religious organization where she thought she had nailed it, and she didn't get the job, and she was crestfallen. And she said to me, "What am I supposed to do? I feel stuck." And we spoke about means of using retrocausality. And I can only tell you what occurred. What occurred was about a week later, the boss man called her and said, "Hey, that job I said no to you for, we just had another opening just like it, except this one has more hours." And let me tell you, it was a very happy ending. Might have happened anyway. Might have happened anyway. But I take a D-Day approach to life. We use everything. We use all of our resources. And it seems to me that magic is a resource that I think the individual should avail him or herself of. And that's what I want people to take from the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's a pleasure having you on, Mitch.
Likewise. Thank you.
It's just, fantastic work, always
Thank you,
well
bro.
thought out. And where can people find all your stuff? It's going to be linked in the description, but for people who want to hear it, where can we find that again, that podcast you brought up, the book, everything?
Well, the podcast is Extraordinary Evidence. ESP is real, and that's on Apple, Spotify, pretty much anywhere you listen to your pods. Um, The book, Practical Magic, you can buy anywhere that you buy books. It's in physical form, it's in digital form, it's in audio. I narrate it. Uh, I just started this newsletter at Substack. It's called Mystery Achievement, and there's some good stuff there. Website is mitchhorowitz.com. I always like to point out I got my email on my website. I don't hide from anybody. You write to me. Please try to be brief, since time as an illusion is very short, but you will hear back from me. Twitter is at Mitch Horowitz. Instagram is at Mitch Horowitz 23. And there's enough there to keep you busy until the phone call comes.
Yeah. Uh, again, I thank you so much for spending your time. I could talk to you forever, and I
Thank
look
you.
forward to speaking to you again sometime.
Likewise, anytime, man. And thank you for what you're doing because you have broadened the search. You have broadened the UFO space, and you have brought together people who are interested in disclosure and who are interested in these extra-physical questions. And you've shown them that we're all really asking the same questions. So bravo to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Take care, Mitch.
Thank you, my man.